Welcome to the Health Headliner podcast by Tudu Digital. Our content is informational only and not medical advice. Please consult your provider. Now, let's dive into today's headlines.
I was thinking about the last time I really moved my body, not because I had to, but just because it felt good.
Oh, yeah.
It definitely wasn't like a planned workout at the gym or anything. It was more like, just dancing around the kitchen to my favorite song.
I totally get that. Sometimes those spontaneous moments of movement are the best.
Right. But it made me wonder, what if those little bursts of fun movement, like dancing around, are actually a pretty decent workout? Could they actually be doing something for our fitness?
That's such a great question, and it's actually what we're going to be digging into today.
Perfect.
You shared some really cool stuff with us, a scientific study with the very descriptive title, Absolute and Relative Intensities of Solo, Free-Form Dancing in Adults. A pilot study.
Catchy, right?
And a super helpful health news article that talks about, general recommendations for physical activity.
Yeah, I thought they'd be perfect for a deep dive. What we really want to get at the bottom of is how much of a workout we might be getting from something as simple and enjoyable as dancing around. No choreography, no fancy steps, just moving to the music.
Exactly, just letting loose.
Yeah, and unpacking what this research tells us about the intensity of this kind of free movement. Is it really enough to get our heart rate up? Can it actually contribute to our overall health?
Those are the big questions we're going to be tackling.
For sure. And you know what? I think this information could actually change how we all think about staying active. It might help us find more enjoyable ways to move our bodies, which I think is so important.
Totally agree. You brought these sources to our attention, and honestly, I was really fascinated by the idea that something as simple as dancing in your living room could potentially be a surprisingly effective workout.
Me too.
Yeah.
All right, so let's dive right in. What can you tell us about this pilot study? What were the researchers trying to figure out?
So the main question they wanted to answer was, well, pretty straightforward. How intense is self-selected free-form dancing for adults? They wanted to see if it was really enough to get your heart pumping.
Okay, so how did they go about measuring that?
Well, they had 48 adults participate in the study, with ages ranging from 18 to 65.
Got it. So a decent mix of ages.
Yeah, and these individuals had different levels of experience with formal dance training, which I thought was really interesting.
That makes sense. You wouldn't want everyone to be professional dancers.
Exactly. They wanted to see how it worked for everyday people. So each person participated in 2 5-minute dancing sessions.
2 different sessions.
Yeah, one where they danced to music of their own choosing. They got to pick their favorite tunes.
Nice.
And another session where they danced without any music playing at all. And these 2 sessions were spaced out by at least 24 hours.
Interesting. So one with music and one without. I'm curious to see how those compare.
Me too. The key instruction for the participants was, and I'm quoting here, to dance in their usual fashion.
So no pressure to do any specific steps or routines.
Nope, just move how they normally would when dancing. They were also told to aim for an intensity level that they perceived as either moderate or vigorous.
So it was really up to them how hard they pushed themselves.
Yeah, they had the freedom to decide what felt right for their body.
Okay, so they've got their music or no music, and they're moving freely. How did the researchers actually capture what was happening physically during these freestyle dance sessions?
All right, so this is where it gets a bit technical. During each 5-minute dance period, the researchers were carefully monitoring a few things. They used a portable indirect calorimeter, which is a mouthful.
I know, right?
But basically, it's a device that measures how much oxygen the participants were using.
Okay, and why is that important?
Because the amount of oxygen you use is a good indicator of how much energy your body is expending.
So the more oxygen you use, the more calorie you're burning, essentially.
Exactly. They were also keeping track of the participants' heart rates using a wireless monitor, which is a bit more familiar, I think.
Yeah, definitely. So they're measuring oxygen consumption and heart rate, 2 key indicators of physical exertion.
Exactly. And then right after each 5-minute dance session, the participants were asked to rate how hard they felt they had been working, using the Borg rating of perceived exertion scale, which is often just called the Borg scale.
Okay, the Borg scale. I remember hearing about that. Can you remind us how that works?
Sure. It's basically a scale that goes from 6 to 20, and it's used to gauge your perceived exertion or how hard you feel your body is working during physical activity.
So a lower number means you're not working very hard, and a higher number means you're really pushing yourself.
Exactly. And that scale is often used in research and in fitness settings to get a sense of how people are feeling during exercise.
Makes sense. So they had all this data from the equipment measuring oxygen use and heart rate, and then they also had the participants' own subjective ratings of how hard they felt they were working. What did they do with all that information?
Well, the researchers wanted to analyze the data in a way that would give them a clear picture of how intense this type of freeform dancing really was.
Okay, so how do they do that?
They calculated a few key measures. One was metabolic equivalence, often shortened to METs.
METs, right? I've heard that term before, but I'm a little fuzzy on what it actually means.
Yeah, it can be a little confusing. It's basically a way to express the energy cost of an activity relative to your resting metabolic rate. Your resting metabolic rate is the amount of energy you use when you're just sitting still doing nothing.
Okay, so it's a comparison point.
Right. One MET is equal to the energy you use at rest. So if an activity has a MET value of 3, that means it requires 3 times the amount of energy you use at rest.
Got it. So higher MET values mean more intense activity.
Precisely. And then they also looked at heart rate reserve.
Okay, another term I've heard but could use a refresher on.
No problem. Heart rate reserve is the difference between your maximum heart rate and your resting heart rate. It's expressed as a percentage.
So it tells you how much of your heart's capacity you're using during an activity.
Exactly. And they also incorporated the ratings of perceived exertion from the Borg scale to see how those lined up with the objective measurements. And to analyze all this information and find patterns and relationships, they used some statistical models. They were particularly interested in connections between these measures and factors like whether music was playing and also the participants' body mass index.
Body mass index or BMI.
Yeah, just to see if there were any differences in intensity based on body size.
Okay, that makes sense. So they gathered all this data, they crunched the numbers, they ran their analyses. What were the main takeaways? What did they discover about how intense this kind of spontaneous dancing can be?
Well, the results were pretty interesting and maybe even a little surprising. On average, the relative intensity of the dancing, what the participants chose themselves, was enough for them to reach a moderate intensity level of exercise.
Moderate intensity.
Yes, and that was true whether they had music playing or not. Both the metabolic equivalent values, which were at least 3.0 on average, and the heart rate reserve, which was at least 40% on average, supported this conclusion.
Moderate intensity, that rings a bell. That aligns with some of those general recommendations we see for overall health and fitness, right?
You got it. A lot of health guidelines recommend aiming for at least 150 minutes of moderate intensity activity per week or 75 minutes of vigorous intensity activity.
Right, I remember hearing that. So this kind of dancing could actually contribute to meeting those goals.
Precisely. And what was even more interesting is that a pretty significant percentage of the participants, 74% when they were grooving to music, and 65% even without music, hit at least that moderate percentage of their heart rate reserve. And even more exciting, a good chunk of them actually reached what's considered vigorous intensity, which is above 60% of their heart rate reserve.
Wow, so even without any structured routine, just moving to music could be a pretty solid workout for a lot of people.
It seems that way. Now, remember those metabolic equivalent numbers we talked about?
Yeah, the METs.
Well, when they averaged those out, they found that the absolute intensity of dancing with music was 5.6 METs, and without music, it was 5.1 METs.
And those both fall into the moderate intensity category.
Yep, according to those established physical activity guidelines.
So it's looking like our initial hunch might be right. Just dancing around could actually contribute to our fitness goals.
It's definitely promising. Now, one thing I found really interesting was how the participants' own perception of their effort level compared to those objective measurements from the equipment. Like, did they feel as worked out as the numbers suggested?
Yeah, that's a good point. We're often told to listen to our bodies, but does that actually match up with what's happening physiologically?
Right. Well, in this study, it actually did line up pretty well. The participants generally rated their dancing somewhere between moderate and somewhat hard on that Borg scale.
Which makes sense, considering the MPs and heart rate reserve data, right?
Exactly. It suggests that even when we're just moving freely and having fun, we can often sense how hard our bodies are working.
That's reassuring. We don't necessarily need to be hooked up to machines to know if we're getting a good workout.
Exactly. Now, remember how the study had people dancing both with and without music?
Yeah, I've been curious about that. Did they find any difference in the intensity levels depending on whether music was playing?
They did. The results showed that music was significantly linked to a higher average intensity in terms of those metabolic equivalents. So dancing with music seemed to lead to a more energetic session overall.
That makes sense, right. Music can be so motivating. It makes you want to move.
Absolutely. It can get you energized and make you want to move more without you even realizing you're putting in more effort.
So if you want to up the intensity of your dance session, put on your favorite tunes.
Definitely crank up the volume. Okay, so we've talked a lot about what this study found, but it's also important to remember that, like any research, this study has some limitations.
Right. No study is perfect.
Exactly. And being aware of the limitations helps us interpret the findings in a balanced way.
Absolutely. So what are some of the things we should keep in mind when we consider these results?
Well, first off, it's important to remember that this was a pilot study, as we mentioned earlier.
Okay, so that means...
It means it involved a relatively small number of participants, only 48 adults.
That's not a huge sample size.
No, it isn't. So, while the results are certainly intriguing and provide some really valuable insights, we need to be cautious about generalizing them to the entire population.
So we can't definitively say that everyone will experience the same level of intensity from dancing.
Right. More research with larger and more diverse groups of people would give us more confidence in applying these findings more broadly.
Okay, that makes sense. What else should we consider?
Well, another limitation is that the participants got to choose their own dance style and intensity.
Right, they were dancing in their usual fashion.
Exactly. And that's great for reflecting how people might actually dance in their everyday lives, but it also means there was a lot of variability in how people moved.
So some people might naturally dance more vigorously than others.
Precisely. So we need to keep in mind that these findings might not represent how everyone would approach free-form dancing.
Okay, good point. Any other limitations we should be aware of?
Well, the dance sessions were pretty short, only 5 minutes each.
Yeah, that doesn't seem like a super long workout.
Right, and while that was enough time to observe moderate intensity in many of the participants, we don't know for sure if people could sustain those intensity levels for longer periods.
Like if they dance for 30 minutes, would they still be working at a moderate intensity?
That's a great question, and one that future research could definitely explore.
So there's room for more research to see how these findings hold up over longer durations of dancing.
Exactly. And one final limitation to keep in mind is that the study only included adults between the ages of 18 and 65.
So it might not be applicable to younger people or older adults.
It's possible. We don't know if the results would be the same for other age groups, and the study also didn't specifically focus on individuals with any health conditions.
So we should be careful about assuming these findings apply to everyone across the board.
Exactly. It's always wise to consider the specific context of the research.
For sure. Okay, so we've talked about the findings and the limitations. What about the researchers themselves? What were their overall thoughts on what they discovered?
Well, they were pretty excited about the potential implications of their findings. They suggested that encouraging free-form dance could be a really valuable strategy for promoting physical activity, especially for people who might not find structured exercise all that appealing.
So it's about finding something that people actually enjoy doing.
Exactly. If you enjoy it, you're way more likely to stick with it. They also emphasized that their study provides evidence that this kind of self-determined dance can be a moderate to vigorous intensity activity, which is pretty significant.
Yeah, that could definitely influence how we think about physical activity recommendations in the future.
For sure. They also pointed out the importance of individual choice in physical activity. Like, when people have the freedom to choose their own dance style and intensity, it can empower them to move more regularly and in a way that feels authentic to them.
I love that. It's about taking ownership of your own movement and finding what feels good for you. Okay, so that's what the researchers had to say. Now, we also have this health news article that you shared, which gives some more general advice about physical activity. How does this study on free-form dancing fit into that broader context?
Well, a lot of health news articles stress the importance of finding ways to move your body that you genuinely enjoy.
Right, they often say that any movement is better than none.
Exactly. And they also talk about how crucial it is to find activities that you can see yourself doing long term, something that you're not going to dread.
So you're more likely to stick with it if it's something you look forward to.
Precisely. And I think the study on freeform dancing provides some really solid scientific backing for that advice.
So it's not just a nice sounding idea. It actually has evidence to support it.
It does. This study demonstrates that something as fun and accessible as dancing can actually be a significant form of physical activity.
That's a powerful message. It's like a permission slip to move your body in ways that feel good and to let go of the idea that exercise has to be a chore.
Exactly. This study really broadens our understanding of what counts as a workout. It might just encourage more people to get moving in a way that works for them.
I hope so. So for our listeners out there, I want to leave you with this thought. Think about how you currently approach physical activity. Do you schedule specific workouts, or do you tend to move more spontaneously? Could you see yourself incorporating a bit more free-form dancing into your life?
Maybe try putting on some music while you're doing chores around the house, just see what happens. Or have a mini dance party during your lunch break. You might be surprised at how good it feels and how much of a workout it can actually be.
And on that note, it really makes you wonder, what other everyday activities might have hidden fitness benefits? We tend to think of exercise as something separate from our daily lives, but maybe it doesn't have to be. Maybe there are all sorts of ways to move our bodies that are both enjoyable and beneficial. It's definitely something to ponder.
I think you're onto something there. It's all about finding those little opportunities to move in ways that make us feel good.
Absolutely.
It's about celebrating movement in all its forms.
Well said. Thanks for joining me for this deep dive. It's been eye-opening, to say the least.
My pleasure, as always. It's always a great conversation.
Until next time, keep moving and keep exploring.
Thanks for tuning in to the Health Headliner podcast by To Digital. Like and subscribe for more health news and breakthroughs. Stay healthy and informed. See you next time.